In this video, I'm going to show you how to use lens corrections. That's both chromatic aberration and profile corrections. It will help you to get a better quality image. They exist because our lenses aren't perfect. There are still distortions applied by our lenses, and we need to correct them using Adobe Lightroom. So we have Adobe Lightroom CC and Classic CC. This is Classic CC, this is CC as we know by now. And I'm going to start, as always, using Classic CC, and I'll show you the same process in Lightroom CC too. So we're going to start off by talking about profile corrections. We also have chromatic aberration, but we'll come back to that. I will preface this by saying I apply this to pretty much every photograph I take. I like to do it as one of the first adjustments, make sure it's applied, because then I know that I have a nice clean image to work from, and I don't have to come through, hit a button later and find that my exposure changes, and then I have to go and undo something else, which you'll see in just a moment. So profile corrections. This really depends on the focal length you're shooting at. This photo was shot at 14 millimeters, this one too, and this one too. And I believe this next one is going to be shot at 35 millimeters, 135 millimeters, and then 24 millimeters. So let's see how the profile correction changes as we go through the different range of focal lengths. When you shoot at a really wide focal length, you're going to see a lot more distortion in your image. You'll see that even though this photo has a straight horizon in it, not much more straight than the sea, there's actually some bowing in the middle because of the distortion. And this is almost in the center of the frame. That is how drastic the distortion can be when you're shooting at a really wide focal length. So that's something we're going to want to try and correct. And if I go down here and I hit Enable Profile Corrections, you'll notice immediately that there's a vignette removed from this photograph. You can see the corners become a lot brighter. And you also see that that shape of the horizon, although it is still bowed out a little bit, it does straighten up a little bit. It makes quite a big difference in my photograph. So I'm going to turn this on. It's found the lens I was shooting, which is a Rokinon 14 millimeters, and it's found the profile that it has inside Adobe Lightroom. If you use some weird and wonderful lenses and there's no profile inside Adobe Lightroom, I believe it is possible to find these profiles online and import them. That's a little bit advanced though, and not a very common use case. 99.9% of the lenses you will use will be found in here. That includes like DJI if you use a drone, or iPhone and Samsung and Huawei, all these different cameras on different phones you'll also find inside Adobe Lightroom. So you don't need to worry too much about that. We'll come back to this photo in just a moment. Let's look at the other two 14mm photos here. So this one's shot on a cruise ship, and this is a really good example of the kind of distortion you're going to see if you don't use profile corrections. And even just shooting at a 14mm towards the corners of your photographs, you're going to see some really drastic distortions. So let's zoom in over here. You can see these perfectly circular lights on the ship here, whereas if you come over to the right here, you can see that oval shape because they're being stretched out to the corner. You can also see these windows look a lot more drastically shaped than they do on the left-hand side over here. So we can see that there is some distortion going in. So I'm going to turn on Enable Profile Corrections. And again, the first thing you'll see is that the image straightens out a little bit, tries to correct some of that profile distortion, and it also removes a vignette that is applied due to the nature of the lens. The lens automatically applies a vignette to the photo because of how it's built. Adobe Lightroom is trying to undo that with processing. And again, you can see this was shot at Petra in Jordan here. And as I turn this on and off, you can see stretching into the corners like so. So let's go back to this first image now. And we have some distortion still across this horizon. And I'm not trying to say that you need to get this perfectly straight. Certainly in this photograph here of the ship, we have this horizon nice and straight, so there's no real distortion there. And okay, we do have some distortion on these lights, but that's to be expected. You're shooting at 14mm, just deal with it. Don't try and correct these minor details because it's part of the look of shooting at 14mm. I don't want it to be really, really drastic, but it's okay to have some of this distortion, especially towards the very far edges of the photograph. So back to this photograph. Now we have an option to go through and adjust the distortion and the vignetting. So vignetting we've spoken about. If I push this to the left, it's basically removed the removal of the vignette and just set it back to how it was. Or we can push it to the right, and now you can see it's trying to remove even more of the lens's vignette. I never touch it myself, I'll leave that in the middle. Distortion does get a slightly different treatment to it because we're doing the same thing again that we did to the vignette. We're adjusting how much or how little of this adjustment, this correction is being applied to the photograph. If I set it back to 0, no distortion, adjustment, correction is being made to this photograph. If I push it to 100, that's the standard when we click that button, and as I push it to 200, you can see we've doubled that distortion correction. And this is actually considerably better, I would say, than it was before at 100. We don't have such an obvious bow to this shape of this horizon. So I might actually leave this at 200 here to clear this up a little bit. Now that's done, let's go through to the manual section. So we're working on just distortion at the top here. Defringe comes in just a moment when we start to talk about the chromatic aberration. And here we can adjust this distortion again, and I can keep pushing this like so until I'm happy with a straight horizon. That's maybe even a little bit too straight. You can see it actually dips in a bit over here, I think. And I've turned on constrain crop here. So if I do that again, but I keep constrain crop off, you'll see exactly what's happening to the photograph. You'll see that the top of the image and the bottom of the image is being pushed in to try and correct that distortion on the horizon. So I'm going to leave constrain crop on, and I'm just going to push it to about there, and there we have a straight horizon again. We've corrected the distortion from that 14mm lens. We can try to do the same again using the cruise ship here, where we have some more details that we maybe don't want to adjust too much. Constrain crop is on. And perhaps you want to do that, but again, I don't think it's really necessary in a photograph like this. So that is profile corrections for your photographs. We will notice here that we have been doing 14mm profile corrections. Let me show you how that changes as we move through the focal length range. So here we're shooting at 35mm, and look, when I press enable profile corrections, really there's no distortion, the barrel distortion from the shape of the image. Very little is happening here, but we do still have quite a strong vignette. The 24-70 f2.8L from Canon actually has quite a lot of vignetting on the lens. In fact, the first one that I bought from them, I sent back immediately because it was really, really drastic. It had been poorly calibrated before it shipped out to me, so I sent it back to them. But you will find that a varying degree of distortion and vignetting is going to apply to your lenses. So at 35mm, not a lot of distortion, but definitely some vignetting going on here. And as we go and look now at 135mm, very little is happening there, very little vignette, and very little profile distortion. Turning it on actually seems a little bit pointless, but it's something I just do as a default anyway. So that's profile corrections. Now let's have a look at chromatic aberration. This is something that you won't find in every photograph, but often if you zoom all the way in, you'll find just small amounts of it. So what I like to do is turn it on anyway. I can't see any just by looking at a first glance on this photograph, but it still helps to have it on because it's not going to damage the photograph. I'll turn that on and you won't see a difference, but you might see a difference if there is something there to correct. This is a great photograph to show you how chromatic aberration works, because if I zoom into the top right hand corner, you'll see there is both a red glow and a bluey green glow around these iron bars. You will often find that your lens picks up some of this chromatic aberration because there is a very thin detail against a bright background. I've seen this many times before, and it's why I like to automatically turn on enable profile corrections. For this, I'm actually going to zoom in a little bit further, and I'll change this now to 4:1, and you can see there's a real glow around these iron railings. When I turn on remove chromatic aberration, look what happens. That glow that surrounds these iron bars has now disappeared. We can also see it down here. It is a little bit pixelated because I've zoomed in really far, but you can see there was a red glow underneath and a blue glow above. We turn this on and it disappears. That is going to give us a better image quality, which is why I always like to turn it on. If you find that the remove chromatic aberration button doesn't do a great job, you can do it manually. You can come over to manual here, and what it's going to ask you to do is you select the defringe tool, the color picker, and it says use the eyedropper to select the purple and green fringes for correction. So let's turn that off. Then I'm coming here and I'm looking for purple and green fringe colors for correction. So here we don't really see any purple or green, but maybe if I go up here, there's some purple there. And there, by selecting that, you can see that we've removed and corrected that color correction for the chromatic aberration. That's removing chromatic aberration and applying profile corrections in the lens correction section of Adobe Lightroom. It works really well, and it's something I apply to all of my photographs. Before we finish, I'm going to take you over now and I'll show you how to do the same thing inside Adobe Lightroom CC. It's basically the same, just not as many details here. You can go through to the optics section, enable lens correction, remove chromatic aberration. You don't have the manual section for chromatic aberration, but you do have some of the lens correction options here. So you can do the distortion correction and the lens vignetting, but it is a little bit more basic than we're used to inside Adobe Lightroom Classic CC. Just one more reason why you might want to use Classic CC over Standard CC. So you can see here, we can apply some more distortion correction and adjust the lens vignetting, but it doesn't do that whole thing that we did before. We went into the manual section and adjusted it there. So I do still recommend Adobe Lightroom Classic CC. Thanks for watching. If you have any questions, please leave me a comment.